and he holds his major convention in 1920. That's 3 years out. So in a very, very short period of time, this man comes on the stage in Harlem and organizes a global movement. Basically, every place where black people were, there were chapters of the Marcus Garvey and UNIA organization in the Caribbean, in Central America, in South America, in South Africa, in West Africa, all over Europe. Wherever black people were, there were chapters of Marcus Garvey's UNIA.
While many blacks were supporters of Garvey, the money they invested in his black-owned corporations was lost to poor management and poor judgment. Garvey was then targeted by a young government prosecutor named J. Edgar Hoover, and was later convicted of fraud and deported to his homeland of Jamaica.
This is where J. Edgar Hoover cut his teeth. This was his first candidate for undermining and suppressing was Marcus Garvey. He starts off in the FBI after Marcus Garvey. But it isn't just Hoover after Garvey. All the major colonial powers had their intelligence communities organized to try to destroy the foundations of this Marcus Garvey movement.
As many people, I would say, who are visionaries, they want to get the message out. They don't deal with what I'd call the minutia of the everyday business and taking care of the business. And what ends up happening, you leave it in the hands of other people, you don't oversee it, and who knows what happens. And he didn't know, and that was his undoing. It led to mail fraud, and he was convicted, and it was his own records that convicted him pretty much. And he, in the end, was deported, and subsequently he died as a pauper.
Unfortunately, throughout most of the 20th century, black neighborhoods were often the most neglected in city services, from health care to schools to parks. In fact, of the hundreds of city parks built in the 1930s and 1940s, only 2 were in black neighborhoods. By the early 1940s, Harlem was the city's largest black community. But even here, over 3/4 of the businesses were owned by whites. What's more, these businesses hired few blacks, and if they did, it was for menial jobs. Black activist Adam Clayton Powell led a boycott of these businesses, which led to the hiring of some blacks. Then, in 1944, Powell was elected as the first black congressman from New York.
Adam Clayton Powell says to the African American community that he was bright, articulate, beautiful. He was a preacher, and African Americans love our preachers. And because of that, he had a great following.
And there is a God who rules above with a hand of power and a heart of love. And if I'm right, thank God I'm right. He'll fight my battle, and I'll be free someday.
Once he made the leap into the national market, he had everyone's support, it would seem, particularly in the African American community. He was able to dazzle in a way that we hadn't seen, and to be able to wield power in Congress the way Adam Clayton Powell did was phenomenal.
Adam was incredibly ahead of his time. Among the things that people don't realize is that virtually every strategy and tactic that was used by the civil rights movement during the period of the 50s and 60s, sit-ins and demonstrations and all the rest of that, to overthrow the systems of racial apartheid and segregation in the South, Adam had in fact employed to overthrow the existence of those systems in the North here in New York City. What he took from Harlem to Washington was his sense of his commitment to social justice and his absolute abhorrence of racial segregation in any form. And he arrives in Congress, and Congress is racially segregated. The black newspaper reporters couldn't come into the halls of Congress because of racial segregation. Well, he started busting that up. Most importantly, Powell authored some of the major social legislation that made what we came to know as the Great Society possible.
Adam Powell was also in the Congress. He was able to, even though there were few blacks in the Congress, Adam Powell was able to show himself as one of the truly great political leaders in America, at least in terms of gaining influence in the Congress, until finally he headed the House Committee on Education. Adam Powell was one of the most charismatic leaders of the 20th century, and a great African-American leader.
Powell's outspoken opposition to racism and his flamboyant lifestyle made him many political enemies. In the early 1960s, he became involved in a lawsuit with a woman who claimed he had wrongly accused her of collecting police payoffs. He was cited for contempt of court in 1966 for refusing to pay damages, and in 1967 the House voted to deprive him of his seat. Nonetheless, in 1968 he was re-elected to Congress, but was then deprived by the House of his committee chairmanship and his seniority status.
One of the things that the American media does, which is terribly unfortunate, is that no matter what you've achieved in your life, if they ever get you on something that they're critical of, their practice is not to criticize you, it's to demonize you. And in the process of demonization, you basically liquidate all of their life and all of their achievements, and it gets summed up in this one act that they consider to be problematic. And so by the time that he was coming to the end of his life, they had entered that demonic phase, and a lot of his achievements just get pushed to the side.
In 1969, the Supreme Court ruled that the action of the House in depriving Powell of his seat had been unconstitutional. But by this time, his health was failing. After his defeat in the 1970 Democratic primary, Powell retired to the island of Bimini in the Bahamas. He died in April of 1972 in Miami, Florida. Adam Clayton Powell was a charismatic, fiery, and powerful speaker, as was another black leader of the 1960s, Malcolm X.
When a criminal starts misusing me, I am going to use whatever is necessary to get that criminal off my back. And the injustice that has been inflicted upon Negroes in this country by Uncle Sam is criminal. Don't blame a cracker in Georgia for your injustices. The government is responsible for the injustices. The government can bring these injustices to halt.
The media decided to try to juxtapose Malcolm against Martin. Martin was a pronounced committed person to the philosophy of nonviolence. In media terms, the only thing that made any sense was to try to paint Malcolm as the exponent of violence. There's nothing in Malcolm's rhetoric that suggests that he was seeking a violent resolution to anything. He was absolutely committed to defending himself and his people, but there was no kind of proactive, let's organize our guerrilla warfare group and go out and kill all the white folk. That is not a part of any of Malcolm's own statements or any of his practices.
In the 1960s, Malcolm X spearheaded a black nationalist movement to defend black Americans against white racism and violence. Born in Nebraska, Malcolm X came to New York to establish the black Muslim movement in the nation's biggest city. His fiery speeches and radical views caused the Nation of Islam to gain much popularity among many New York blacks. Malcolm X, however, discovered corruption within the ranks of the black Muslim movement and left it. He formed his own organization called Muslim Mosque Incorporated. In 1964, he made a trip to Mecca, Saudi Arabia, that changed his life. He came back with a new message, a message of understanding and cooperation between all races. The leader of the black Muslim movement, Elijah Muhammad, saw Malcolm X as a threat to his power. In February of 1965, while making a speech at Manhattan's Audubon Ballroom, Malcolm X was shot 15 times at close range by 3 gunmen. The 39-year-old black leader was pronounced dead upon his arrival at the hospital. A year later, the 3 gunmen were convicted of murder. All 3 were members of the black Muslims. Despite many legal triumphs for black Americans, the daily life for many black New Yorkers didn't seem to be any more encouraging. In July 1964, the killing of a black youth by a white police officer caused rioting that lasted 3 days, leaving 1 dead and 141 seriously injured. New York Mayor John Lindsay then formed a civilian review board to probe police brutality. Lindsay's efforts to promote better race relations contributed greatly to New York's escaping the mass rioting that besieged many American cities in April of 1968, when Martin Luther King was assassinated. In the 1950s and 60s, blacks did make more progress in electing black government officials to represent them. In 1953, Hewlin Jack was elected Manhattan Borough President. He was the first African American to hold a major elective office in a major American city. In 1965, Constance Baker Motley was appointed acting Manhattan Borough President. She was followed by Percy Sutton, who would serve as the Manhattan Borough President for the next 11 years. Future New York Mayor David Dinkins also served as the Manhattan Borough President. In 1968, Shirley Chisholm was elected to represent the 12th Congressional District in Brooklyn, becoming the first female African American in the United States Congress.
Shirley Chisholm was an important, not only as a congressperson, but as a symbol for black women in America. Not only did she represent Brooklyn, her Brooklyn district in the United States Congress, but in many ways she represented all blacks, and black women in particular, in the halls of Congress.
When Ed Koch was elected mayor, he promised New Yorkers he would make the tough decisions a mayor had to. During his 12 years, the city was rocked by numerous racial incidents that widened New York's racial divide. To address the hostility between police and minority groups, Benjamin Ward was appointed the first black New York police commissioner in 1984. Throughout the first 4 decades of the 20th century, African Americans struggled for equal rights in the political arena, and indeed in all other areas of American life. Progress was made, but it was slow and frustrating. Then, in the spring of 1947, on a ball field in Brooklyn, New York, a courageous young black American named Jackie Robinson was in the starting lineup for the Brooklyn Dodgers on opening day.
In the street, Jackie Robinson hit that ball. It went zooming across the left field wall. Yeah, boy. Yes, Jackie.
There is no greater figure in terms of the impact on the social history in America than Jackie Robinson. In April 1947, when Jackie took the field for the Brooklyn Dodgers, not only did he integrate, break the color line of Major League Baseball, but he really broke the color line for mainstream America. This was an absolute first in America. We had seen black firsts in each decade of the 20th century, in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, but it was generally a first. Rarely did you see a second. In the case of Jackie Robinson, he was entering the American dream, the American pastime, baseball, and it wasn't just a fact of just Jackie coming. Branch Rickey knew, and Jackie, I think, knew as well, that more blacks were going to come. This was the first time in the American mainstream that an African American was to be seen, and he was going to be seen nationally as well.
A month before Martin Luther King died, he was at my house for dinner in Los Angeles one night, and he told me at my dinner table, he said, "Don, you and Jackie and Roy will never know how easy you made it for me to do my job." And this is 1968.